Let's begin here, because too many confuse presence with proximity. A woman who's always available isn't always seen. She texts first. She answers quickly. She explains over and over, trying to be understood. But the more she shows up, the more invisible she becomes. Not because she isn't worthy, but because she never paused long enough to be missed. We were taught that love means effort, that silence is cold, that absence means failure. But real love, the kind that returns, often begins when you stop filling every space. Because it is in the quiet, not the noise, that your true worth begins to echo. Before I continue, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and if reflections like this resonate, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now let's go deeper. Many women ask, "What did I do wrong?" But that question often hides a deeper truth. It's not that she did too little, it's that she did too much, without pausing to ask, for whom and why? When your energy flows constantly towards someone who isn't reaching back, you don't just lose time, you lose yourself. Carl Jung wrote that the soul often speaks through what the ego tries to silence. And for many, that voice comes in moments of stillness, not in the frantic rush to fix, explain, or prove. There's a difference between giving and emptying, between loving and leaking. The woman who never says no, who answers every call, forgives every slight, fills every silence with reassurance, may look devoted. But beneath the surface, something sacred is being spent. You see, when love is poured into someone who no longer honors it, the soul begins to retreat. Not out of bitterness, but in quiet self-preservation. And this retreat is not failure. It's the beginning of individuation, the process of returning to one's inner center. In Jungian terms, this is where the persona, the outer mask, begins to crack. And from that fracture, the true self begins to emerge. Not louder, but deeper. Not more available, but more whole. Silence, then, is not passive. It is a boundary, a threshold. And when used with awareness, it becomes the most powerful message you'll ever send. This is not about punishment or manipulation. It's about coming home, to yourself, to the voice within that never begged, never chased, and never needed to be chosen to have value. This story isn't about him. It's about the quiet moment when she realizes she was always the one worth returning to. There comes a quiet moment sometimes in a kitchen, sometimes in a message left unanswered, when a woman realizes she's been performing love instead of receiving it. She's the one who reaches out, the one who reassures, the one who waits up texts first and forgives early. Not because she's weak, but because she's afraid. Afraid that if she doesn't keep showing up, she'll be forgotten. And so she shows up everywhere, but inside herself. This is the first fracture. And it doesn't always look like heartbreak. Sometimes it's just a shift, the realization that what she's calling love is actually a fear of being alone. What begins as devotion becomes depletion. What once felt romantic now feels one-sided. She begins to notice it in small moments, when her message is ignored, when her needs are postponed, when silence stretches a little too long, and yet she keeps giving. Not because he asked for more, but because she doesn't know how to stop. Carl Jung spoke of how the persona, the mask we wear to be accepted, slowly replaces the self if we're not careful. A woman can become so used to being agreeable accommodating, emotionally available, that she no longer remembers what it's like to simply be. And this is where the true pain begins. Not from his absence, but from the realization that somewhere along the way, she abandoned herself. The fracture deepens when she confuses response with value. She checks the phone, rereads the thread, waits for signs. And every hour that passes without one feels like a quiet confirmation. Maybe she isn't enough. But this is the trap. The belief that love must be earned through effort. That if she just tries harder, says the right thing, stays patient, stays soft, then maybe she will be chosen again. It is here that the woman's shadow begins to stir. The part of her she's tried to keep quiet, the anger, the sorrow, the silent rage at being overlooked. She tells herself to be calm, to be kind, to stay graceful, but underneath something is screaming. The shadow is not the enemy, it is the part of her that remembers, that knows this pattern is not new. It began long before him. It may have started in childhood, or in past relationships, or in the silent spaces where her voice was never heard. When the shadow is ignored, it doesn't go away. It shows up in over-apologizing, in making excuses for his distance, in pretending she doesn't care as much as she does. It shows up in self-betrayal. She begins to shrink, not physically, but energetically. She pulls back her laughter. She dims her intuition. She starts speaking in ways that won't offend, in ways that won't scare him off, in ways that protect his comfort while erasing her truth. And this, too, is part of the persona, the mask she puts on so he won't leave. But the cost is heavy, because each time she hides her pain, she tells herself it doesn't matter. Each time she silences her truth, she steps further from herself. Jung reminded us that neurosis often stems from the refusal to face legitimate suffering. And here, the legitimate suffering is not his absence. It's the abandonment of her own needs in order to stay close to someone who is drifting. Eventually, she begins to feel it in her body. The fatigue, the tension in her shoulders, the breath that never quite goes deep. Her nervous system no longer feels safe, not because of what's happening, but because of what's not happening. The lack of clarity, the mixed signals, the absence of real reciprocity. She starts to overthink, to replay every word, every tone. She questions herself constantly. Was I too much? Too needy? Too quiet? Too late? And none of the answers bring peace because she's asking the wrong questions. The right question isn't, what did I do wrong? It's, why am I so afraid to stop proving I'm worth staying for? That fear, the fear of not being enough without effort, is the crack in the foundation. And until it is faced, it will shape every relationship she touches. This is the fracture most women don't name because it feels too familiar, too shameful, too raw. But it must be seen. There is no healing without recognition. She cannot begin to reclaim herself until she admits what she's lost. And what she's lost isn't him. It's herself. The self that didn't beg. The self that didn't overgive. The self that didn't tie her worth to anyone's attention. The self that once moved through the world with quiet confidence and who now waits behind the mask. This is the moment the mirror starts to crack. Not to destroy, but to reveal. Because what's been hidden is not her weakness. It's her wound. and wounds, when brought to light, become doors. She stands now in that threshold between the woman who performs and the one who begins to remember who she really is. Before the healing, before the clarity, before the rising, there must be a reckoning, a moment of stillness, a breath. This is where her story begins again, not with a reply, but with a pause. After the fracture comes the reckoning, the slow realization that not all pain comes from others. Some of it comes from the roles we've agreed to play. Many women confuse being kind with being quiet. They confuse being patient with self-abandonment. And for far too long, they've worn a mask called the good one, the one who doesn't complain, who keeps things together, who smiles even while shrinking. This mask Jung called the persona, the version of ourselves we craft to be accepted, admired, and loved. It isn't false, but it's incomplete. It's how we move through the world without showing all that we carry inside. But when the mask becomes too tight, something begins to ache beneath it. That ache is the shadow. The shadow holds everything the persona has tried to hide. The resentment, the unmet needs, the anger we were taught was unattractive. The voice we were told was too much. And now, as the performance begins to unravel, the shadow starts to rise. At first, it shows up in quiet ways. Fatigue that doesn't go away. Irritation at small things. A heavy silence in conversations where once there was hope. It is the soul's way of saying, I can't keep pretending. This is where the real inner tension begins, not between her and someone else, but between her true self and the version she's been presenting. She wants to be chosen, but she also wants to be free. She wants to be seen, but she fears what might be revealed. She wants closeness, but the cost of constant bending is too high. The persona says, stay pleasant, stay available, stay small. But the shadow says, speak, move, withdraw, reclaim. And now she stands in the middle, torn between the need to be loved and the need to return to herself. Jung believed that healing requires the integration of the shadow, not its rejection, not pushing it down, but listening to what it's trying to say. And here the message is clear. You've given enough. You've adjusted enough. Now it's time to stop seeking mirrors in others and begin looking inward. This is not the dramatic rage of someone seeking revenge. It's the quiet revolt of someone tired of negotiating her worth. Because the truth is, no matter how well she plays the role, love that must be earned by self-erasure is not love. It's performance. And performance always requires a stage one where the lights go off when she finally breaks down. This is the turning point most resist. Because without the mask, who is she? Without the texts, the effort, the waiting, what remains is the self-bruised perhaps, but unbroken. Still there under the silence and the shame. Still whole, waiting to be remembered. To meet the shadow is to face the grief of having betrayed oneself. But it is also the beginning of something else, something sacred. A return to dignity. And dignity, unlike approval, cannot be given. It must be claimed. This is the tension of transformation. Not a clean break, but a slow shedding. She will still feel the pull to explain. She may still want to check in, to ask why, to try just once more. But the deeper part of her, knows that would only take her further from herself. This is not about becoming hard, it's about becoming honest, not cold, but clear, not distant, but boundaried. The woman who honors her shadow no longer needs to be liked at the cost of her truth. She no longer fears absence because she has found presence within herself. And though the outside world may not understand this shift, the inner world begins to quiet. The nervous system starts to trust again, not because someone else returned, but because she did. The integration of shadow and persona does not look dramatic. It often looks like stillness, like saying no without guilt, like deleting a message before it's sent, like breathing deeply instead of begging loudly. The ego may resist this. It prefers being needed, validated, praised. But the self desires something far greater: peace. This is the beginning of individuation, the slow, sacred process of becoming whole, of reclaiming all parts: the loving, the fierce, the grieving, the wise. And when a woman reaches this point, she no longer asks, "How do I get him back?" She begins to ask, "Why did I ever leave myself?" The mask starts to dissolve. The shadow is no longer an enemy, and in its place rises something more enduring than romance. A center, a ground, a self that no longer needs to be chosen in order to feel worthy. And in that stillness, when the noise of longing dies down, she hears something she hasn't heard in a long time. Her own voice. Clear, steady, unapologetic. And that is where true change begins. Awakening rarely comes as a loud event. It does not arrive with applause or a sudden revelation that wipes away every doubt. It begins more softly in pauses, in refusals, in moments of unexpected clarity. After the mask cracks and the shadow rises, a woman stands at a threshold. She realizes she cannot keep feeding the old pattern of overgiving and self-erasure, but she also sees that simply withdrawing is not enough. Something deeper must emerge. This is the point where silence changes shape. At first, it was defensive, a way to stop the bleeding, to hold herself together. Now, silence becomes generative. It is no longer emptiness. It is space, a room in which her own voice can finally be heard. Carl Jung often reminded us that individuation, the process of becoming whole, requires meeting what has been repressed. And here she meets herself, not the persona that smiled through rejection, not the shadow that seethed in silence, but the self that has been waiting patiently beneath both. This self does not beg. It does not bargain. It does not need to prove. It simply is. The awakening begins in small choices. She notices when she wants to reach for the phone, and instead, she breathes. She feels the urge to explain herself, and instead, she pauses. She recognizes the fear of being forgotten and allows it to pass through her without obeying it. Each of these small acts becomes a thread slowly weaving a new pattern of strength. Awakening is not a single moment of triumph. It is a daily practice of listening inward instead of outward. It is the rediscovery of her own rhythm after living so long to the pulse of another. And with this practice comes a shift in energy. Her posture changes. Her voice steadies. Her gaze carries weight, not because she is demanding, but because she is present. Presence once drained by need now radiates from wholeness. The contrast is striking. Where once she thought her value depended on constant availability, she now discovers that true value lives in her boundaries. Where once she feared absence, she now sees that absence creates space for longing. Where once she begged to be chosen, she now understands that she was always the chooser. Jung wrote that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. The awakening is precisely this moment, the recognition that what felt like fate was a pattern she can step out of once she sees it. This is why her silence begins to carry weight. It is no longer an act of strategy, but an act of alignment. Her absence is not manipulation. It is truth made visible. And truth has a way of unsettling what is false. In this state, she does not need to chase. She does not need to prove her worth with constant reassurance. Instead, she embodies a rare quality detachment without bitterness. This is not indifference. It is freedom. The awakening brings a new relationship to love itself. She begins to see that love is not about possession or persuasion. It is not about convincing someone to return. It is about becoming so whole within yourself that love, if it comes, is a gift, not a rescue. Her shadow is still present, but now it speaks with guidance rather than sabotage. It reminds her where she once betrayed herself and where she must not again. Her persona is still present too, but it is no longer a mask. It is simply one layer of her expression, no longer mistaken for the whole. Together, shadow and persona integrate into a more complete self. She is no longer divided against herself, no longer acting one way while feeling another. She begins to live in alignment, and that alignment radiates outward. It is here that others begin to notice the change, not because she announces it, but because energy cannot be hidden. Those who once took her for granted now sense something missing: her constant presence, her constant approval. Those who once overlooked her now pause, and some may even try to return. But here is the true awakening: it no longer matters. What matters is not whether they come back, but whether she remains true to herself. What matters is not the approval of others, but the integrity of her own being. This is the moment when longing turns into clarity, the moment when pain becomes fuel, the moment when she steps into the truth. Jung spoke of that wholeness is not achieved by perfection, but by integration. The awakening is not the end of the journey. It is the beginning of a new chapter, one in which she no longer abandons herself to avoid abandonment by others. She no longer bargains away her dignity to hold on to fleeting affection. She no longer confuses noise with love. Now, her silence is filled with presence. Her absence is filled with dignity. Her being is filled with strength. And this strength does not need to be announced. It speaks on its own in every choice she makes, in every boundary she honors, in every step she takes toward herself. Awakening is not about winning him back. It is about winning herself back. And in doing so, she discovers the most profound truth of all, that love, when it is true, meets you where you are whole, not where you are half. Awakening, as we have seen, is the recognition of truth, but recognition without action fades. Transformation begins only when she turns insight into practice, when clarity becomes choice, and choice becomes boundary. This is the point where the inner work must touch the outer world. It is no longer about what she feels inside, but what she does with that knowing. She understands that if she does not act differently, the old pattern will return like a tide. Boundaries are not walls, they are thresholds. They are the invisible lines that say, "This is where I end and you begin. This is what I will give, and this is what I will no longer abandon myself for." Carl Jung wrote that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely, and here, boundaries are the lived form of that acceptance. To set a boundary is to say, "I matter enough to protect myself. I matter enough to decide what is allowed and what is not." At first, the act may seem small. She doesn't respond immediately to the late-night message. She says no to the request that once drained her. She stops explaining, justifying, or softening her needs. Each act feels both unsettling and freeing. The persona resists it, whispers that she will be unloved, that people will walk away. The shadow tempts. It pushes her toward harshness, toward cutting ties in anger. But the self holds steady. It knows that boundary is not cruelty, and silence is not punishment. It is integrity. It is alignment. This stage of transformation often feels paradoxical. On the outside, she may seem quieter, even more withdrawn. But inwardly, energy begins to rise. What once leaked outward in desperate effort now flows back into her. She invests in her body, her work, her friendships, her dreams, not to prove worth, but to live from it. Here is the secret. When a woman claims her boundary, she does not diminish love, she refines it. Love that cannot survive her boundary was never love, only need. And love that honors her boundary grows stronger because it is now rooted in truth. This is where the dynamic with others begins to shift. The one who once overlooked her notices her absence. The one who once expected constant approval senses the change. Some may test the boundary, pushing against it, hoping she will return to the old pattern. But she does not, because this time she knows that to cross her own line would be to lose herself again. Transformation is not only about what she says no to, but also what she says yes to. She begins to say yes to time alone, yes to projects that nourish her, yes to friendships that respect her, yes to the stillness where she can breathe deeply without fear. Her yes becomes sacred because it is no longer automatic. It is chosen. Boundaries are not only external, they are internal as well. She no longer allows her thoughts to spiral endlessly around someone else's approval. She no longer lets her worth hinge on unanswered messages. She notices when self-doubt arises and meets it with presence rather than panic. This, too, is a boundary, a refusal to let her own mind become a battlefield. And she serves us as these choices accumulate, something remarkable happens. The anxious need to be chosen softens. The fear of absence diminishes. In its place grows a quiet confidence, a sense of belonging to herself. It is not arrogance, it is sovereignty. In Jungian terms, this is the crossing from dependence to individuation. She is no longer seeking completion outside of herself. She is moving toward the wholeness that was always within her. The boundary is the bridge. The act that transforms insight into embodiment. Others may not understand this shift. Some may call her distant. Some may accuse her of pride. But their words no longer hold the same power, because she has discovered that the cost of being understood by others is never higher than the cost of abandoning herself. Every boundary she sets becomes a declaration: I am no longer willing to betray myself for the illusion of closeness. I am no longer willing to silence my truth for the comfort of another. I am no longer willing to confuse attention with love. And here, transformation deepens. For the first time, she realizes she has a choice, not just in how others treat her, but in how she treats herself. She can choose to honor her needs, her limits, her voice. She can choose to walk away when something diminishes her spirit. She can choose to remain whole even in solitude. This choice is not a single moment, it is repeated daily. Each time she honors her boundary, she strengthens her self-trust. And self-trust is the ground upon which true intimacy can stand. When a woman reaches this stage, her energy shifts entirely. She no longer radiates desperation, but dignity. She no longer asks to be chosen, but chooses. And in that shift, others feel it, whether they return or not, whether they understand or not. Transformation is not about becoming untouchable. It is about becoming unshakable in what matters most. It is about living in such a way that her worth is no longer negotiable. That is the power of boundary, not to push love away, but to call forth love that is real. And so the woman who once begged for attention now becomes the woman who embodies choice. The woman who once feared silence now becomes the one whose silence speaks louder than words. The woman who once lived in fragments now begins to live from her center. This is transformation, not the abandonment of love, but the refusal to abandon herself. And from this ground, everything changes. Every journey ends where it first began, in the self. Not the self shaped by fear, not the mask built to be accepted, not the shadow left unspoken, but the living center that was always there. We began with the fracture, the fear of being forgotten, the temptation to chase what slips away. We walked through the mask of the persona, the rising voice of the shadow, and the quiet awakening that followed. And in the end, the choice was made to honor dignity through boundary and to live no longer in fragments, but in alignment. What remains now is not a question of return, but a recognition of freedom. The freedom that comes when you no longer trade your worth for attention. The freedom of no longer confusing availability with love. The freedom of knowing that your value does not disappear when someone else walks away. This is the heart of individuation. To stand in your own center without apology. To allow both shadow and light longing and strength absence and presence. And to live without splitting yourself in two. Carl Jung wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And this is what we see here. Not a woman hardened, not a heart closed, but a soul that has remembered itself. A self no longer trapped in performance, but grounded in truth. Love may still come. Someone may still return. But it is no longer the deciding factor. Because when you have returned to yourself, you are no longer waiting at the doorway of another. You are already home. The lesson is simple, though never easy. Silence is not emptiness. Detachment is not indifference. Boundaries are not cruelty. Each is a form of self-respect, a way of saying, I no longer leave myself behind. And when you live this way, something remarkable happens. Your absence begins to speak more powerfully than your pleading ever could. Your presence carries more weight than your explanations ever did. And your worth shines not because someone else has named it, but because you no longer question it. This is not the end of longing. Longing will always be part of the human soul. But now, longing is different. It is not desperation. It is a quiet openness, a willingness to be met, but never again at the cost of yourself. The transformation we have traced is not about strategy, not about winning anyone back. It is about never losing yourself again. That is the true closure, not whether he returns, but whether you do. And so the circle closes. She is no longer the one who begged for love. She is no longer the one who measured her value by unanswered messages. She is no longer the one who disappeared behind her own mask. She has become the one who chooses, the one who stands with dignity, the one who speaks with silence, the one who lives from wholeness. In this final reflection, remember, the world often teaches us to chase, to prove, to perform. But the soul teaches us something else: to rest in the truth of who we are. To know that worth is not given, it is discovered. And once discovered, it cannot be taken. Perhaps this is what individuation truly means. Not perfection, not becoming untouchable, but becoming whole. Living in such a way that you can no longer be replaced because you were never incomplete. So let the silence speak. Let the boundary hold. Let the self return. And may your presence, steady and unshaken, remind you that love begins not in being chosen, but in choosing yourself. Before we close, I invite you to reflect. Which part of this journey spoke most deeply to you? Was it the moment of fracture, the rising of the shadow, or the peace of awakening? Share your thoughts in the comments and let your voice add to this circle of reflection. And if these words resonated, I invite you to pause before leaving. Sit quietly for a breath. Notice the silence within you. That silence is not emptiness. It is where your true strength begins. Because in the end, the story is not about loss. It is about return. And the one you return to is yourself.